Well, hello lovely humans, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going really in depth on something that obviously we've touched on multiple times on this channel, and that is DIY projects. Now we're gonna kind of tangent for a second, but bear with me, it's gonna make sense in a moment. In high school, when we were studying art history, one of the artists that was shown was Jackson Pollock. And I don't know if you've seen any of his work before. I'm gonna go ahead and insert one of the images here, but it's basically splattering paint onto a canvas. And while I can't necessarily speak to why these paintings are so popular, I definitely remember thinking, what? $200 million for that? I could do that. Like, I mean, he's just throwing paint onto a canvas. And you may or may not have had the same thought that I did. Or, you know, if I'm introducing you to Jackson Pollock, you're welcome. But obviously, what you don't see is so many other elements that come into play. You don't know the dry time for that specific kind of paint. You may not necessarily have the space to fling around paint willy-nilly onto a canvas without fear of splattering it onto your furniture. And you definitely don't have the experience. And without having the experience, you might spend 7 extra hours second-guessing every single splatter and every single move, trying your best to replicate this emotional turmoil of ink on canvas, and it just becomes this big deal. And you start to wonder if you've bitten off a little bit more than you could chew. Now, while I'm not saying that your wedding is necessarily parallel to a $200 million painting, what I am saying is there is always a heck of a lot more to each and every element than you might think. And I say this both as an ex-DIY bride and a professional in the field. While I've only been in the wedding industry for a few years, and I'm not an expert that's been in it for several decades, let's just say I've seen some things. So with that in mind, today's topic is DIY or don't. Navigating DIY choices for your wedding day. So without further ado, let's just jump right on into it. For this video, we're gonna use 2 different DIY items, ideas. The first would be invitations, and the second would be farmhouse tables. You can already see that there's probably gonna be a pretty dramatic difference between these two, but I think you'll be surprised to find how much they have in common too. The first thing is know your supplies. When considering DIYing something, think through every single supply you might possibly need to pull that off. If you don't have a miter saw or an impact driver or even a tape measure, making your own farmhouse tables is gonna be a little bit difficult. But on the other hand, something like invitations, if you're printing your own, crafting your own from scratch, you might need to get a paper cutter, which one that's decent enough to make it through 100 invitations might run you about $40. And that could be a bigger expense than you were anticipating. You're not gonna wanna cut those by hand with scissors, you're gonna wanna make sure you have a nice clean cut. The second thing you're gonna wanna consider is know your space. Crafting and building and putting all this stuff together takes up a lot of room in your home. Sometimes you'll need to drop a project for a while, go to the grocery store, go to class, go to your job, and then you come home to this massive mess that you've left behind, and not being able to walk through your garage without stepping on a wood screw for months on end can get really stressful after a while. So if you have a studio apartment, obviously building farmhouse tables from scratch is not going to be a good idea. If you have a home or a dedicated garage or a workspace, it might work out better for you. But even something as simple as crafting invitations can commandeer your dining room table for 6 weeks because you just have to keep leaving the project and you can't quite come back to it. So it ends up just being this eyesore that takes up so much practical space that you actually need to live a normal life. I once worked a backyard wedding where they DIY'd a bunch of stuff. And they had so many items that it actually took over an entire guest room on the property. And for them, it actually ended up working out really well because they had the space to store all of those items. But had it been a smaller home, or if they didn't have that dedicated space, they would be living in chaos for months. So yeah, they had the space, but my point here is you might not. Which brings me to my next point: transportation, setup, and tear down. Building something like farmhouse tables is obviously a very pivotal part of your wedding day. You'll need a place for people to sit at, somewhere for them to put their plates, something to put centerpieces on top of. So if you're building the tables, like, you kind of have to have them on your wedding day. But who's going to transport them? Who's going to set them up? And who's going to tear them down? For most of the typical wedding venues, it's safe to say that setup time is about 2 hours and tear down is usually about 1 hour. That means in order to get 20 8-foot tables from your house to the venue could either require a box truck or several pickup trucks and a whole gaggle of able-bodied peeps to move them from point A to point B, especially if you're doing it in a limited time frame. I mean, 2 people can set up 20 tables if they have several hours to do it, but if you only have 2 hours, then you're gonna need more people to make sure it happens in a timely manner. Again, this one's like a super big example, but even something as small as DIYing your own signage and your own table numbers will require a little bit of planning beforehand to make sure they're brought there safely, set up, and torn down. And of course, this obviously does not apply to invitations because there is no setup, there's no tear down, those are sent out way in advance. So here's actually a positive for DIYing those, you know? The next thing you'll need to consider is know your crew. If you're taking on a massive DIY project, you're probably gonna end up needing help somewhere along the way. Does your fiance want to help? Does he or she have the time to help? Are your bridesmaids interested in picking up a drill and sanding and staining and getting all these tables ready for your wedding day? I definitely don't recommend DIYing alone unless the project is small enough that you can handle it in a timely manner. Even something like invitations, the assembly process for those takes a long time. So oftentimes I do recommend for brides and grooms that are DIYing invites to have like an invitation stuffing party where you have a bunch of people come together with you to put them all together to get them ready to send out in the mail. The next thing you'll need to consider is your personality and your skill set. If you are into woodworking, then building your own tables is gonna feel like a breeze, okay? You're gonna be like, I can do this in my sleep. I am not one of those humans, okay? But if you're a perfectionist that really wants everything to be done perfectly level and perfectly straight and absolutely perfectly perfect, and clutter stresses you out and you get really overwhelmed when your home isn't in a neat and tidy order, then perhaps DIYing farm tables is not gonna be a good call for you. And that can even extend over into invitations. If you are generally a crafty person and you know that you can pull these off, go for it. But just because you're planning a wedding doesn't make you a mini Martha Stewart. So you do need to know yourself and your personality and the skill sets that you currently possess, because you're not gonna change into a different human just because you start wedding planning. The next point, know your limits. Don't take on too many projects, because not even the most super of superheroes can fight all the crime in all of the world in one day. You know, like, even if you are a wedding planning superhero, there's still gonna be things that you cannot do by yourself. So my recommendation is pick one big project. Like if you really wanna DIY, pick one big project and then a smattering of little projects, and don't go beyond that. Next, know your time. As a general rule of thumb, it's a good idea to make something that doesn't have a massive time constraint on it. Examples of this would be farmhouse tables, because like we've been using the whole time, or invitations. Those you can start 8 months in advance if you feel like it, and just kind of chip away at them throughout the planning process. But items like flowers, food, cake, those are all time sensitive and have to be done at the very last minute. Another thing to consider when kind of assessing the amount of time that you have is your life in general. Do you work full time? Are you going to grad school? Do you have a super active social life? Because if you don't have a heap ton of free time, then taking on a giant project like farmhouse tables is probably not in your best interest. But doing invitations that you can slowly chip away at and kind of keep in a nice neat little box and pull out when you're ready to work on them and then put them away when you're done, that's a lot more achievable. Next, know your priorities. This is something that I talked about in like the Frienders video. I'll link that up here. But if it's a high priority, definitely leave it to the professionals. There will be so much more emotional attachment and need for perfection that's placed on something that you've been dreaming about since you were 5 years old. That means that you will spend so much more time hemming and hawing and contemplating and working it back and forth in your mind, trying to achieve this level of perfection because it's something that's really important to you. Sure, maybe that's like a little bit on the dramatic side, but it's definitely something to consider. So if your skill set is on point and you have all the tools and you have the space and you don't mind a little bit of clutter, then yeah, building your own tables from scratch shouldn't be too difficult. I mean, it's gonna be really time consuming, but it's not gonna be that big of a deal because you have all of those other things checked off. But if you want the perfect letterpressed, embossed invitations with gold foiling, it's gonna be a whole lot more difficult for you to pull off, and you're gonna be a lot more stressed when you're trying to do it. And last but most certainly not least, know when to quit, okay? If you're following all these guidelines and you know your space and you know your time and you know your personality, then the last thing that you're gonna need to do is know when to walk away. In the behind the scenes video that I did at Building 177 a couple weeks ago, Lilia, the bride, mentioned that she was really interested in getting a full-length mirror to place in the women's restroom. And something I said to her was like, that's a great thing if we have time. Yes, let's add that in. But if you get down to the end of the wire and you realize that you just can't figure out the transportation, the setup, securing the mirror, all those sorts of things, if it becomes too big of like an emotional burden to try to figure that out, cut it. Because the hard truth is, most of the time your guests will not miss those details. If you're building tables, they're gonna miss those details unless you're having a cocktail style reception. So like, that's a big deal. So definitely, figure that part out ahead of time. But your guests won't miss if you don't do the gold foiling or the letter pressing or the embossing on your invitations because they don't know what your initial plan was, so they have nothing to compare it to. So when it comes to these details, I definitely recommend DIYing just one first. Try your hand at building one farmhouse table. try your hand at putting together one invitation. If you get through it relatively unscathed and you kind of think like, hey, I could do that again 20 times over, 100 times over, great. But if you get through that and you go, that was a little bit more difficult than I anticipated, then this is the time to cut that project and walk away. I honestly think that most people don't spend enough time talking about the emotional toll that wedding planning has. And that's something that I really want to bring attention to on this channel, and I really want to be cognizant of, and I really want you guys to be aware of that this is an emotional time frame. There's a reason that the term bridezilla exists, because wedding planning can make you a little bit crazy. And I really want to be sensitive to that. I mean, you guys know, you're right in the thick of it. So you need to give space to your emotions in wedding planning. You have to, because it is an emotional process. And simple details like having a cluttered home can really have an impact on your emotional health. Spending hundreds of dollars on buying or renting tools for a giant project can definitely put you over budget. And not having a dedicated setup and teardown crew on your wedding day is going to cause you stress on that day. So sometimes you just gotta know when to hold them and when to fold them. The whole cost to value ratio is super subjective. I don't know your life. I don't know what kind of personality you have. I don't know what kind of skill set you have. So at the end of the day, you're gonna have to be the one that decides whether it's worth it or not to pull off some of these DIY items. And let's be honest, there's a huge amount of sticker shock that sometimes comes with getting vendor quotes back, and you think, I could do that myself. And we all know that sometimes it is cheaper to do it yourself. But what I hope you learned from this video is that cold hard cash is not the only currency in play here. Yes, I was a DIY crazy person for my wedding day. I DIY'd a bunch of things. My invitations, I bought tablecloths. We strung all of our own lighting. I did all of my own centerpieces and all of my own florals, and I did backdrops. And so I'm coming from a place of like having experienced this, and I know the emotional toll that it took on me, and I know the amount of space that it took up in my home, and I know the impact that it had on my relationship with my fiance at the time, now husband. Good news, we made it through to the other side, but it was a lot. So take a look at all of the DIY projects that you're contemplating for your wedding day and run through each and every one of these line items to really assess if it's a good idea for you to try to pull this off for your wedding day. I have a feeling like this was a really long video, but it's been a long time coming, and I do some DIYs on this channel, so I do want you to always look at it through this rose-colored lens of like DIY can suck sometimes, just a little bit. So that's all we have for today, folks. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you haven't done so already, like this video because you like the video, and subscribe to this channel for more tips and tricks for the modern day bride. Speaking of subscribe, we're over 30,000, so I just need to put that in there. Come on. Okay. Go give us a follow on social media, Instagram, stuff. Okay, and until next week, bye guys!